Information Risk with David Loshin, powered by Insight Jam.
All right. Welcome back to another episode of the Information Risk Podcast with David Loshin. I'm Doug Atkinson here at Solutions Review, and that next to me is David Loshin from Knowledge Integrity, Principal Analyst, and also one of our Solutions Review experts for all things data governance. And today, David, we are digging in on all kinds of AI-based issues with regard to misrepresentation or misidentification, I guess, is one of the topics. Why don't you take it away with the example that you brought to the table?
So thanks, Doug. And again, welcome back to the podcast. And actually, we're not going to talk about AI because these are algorithms that have been around for 50, 60, maybe 70 years.
Okay.
So it predates artificial intelligence, but what we're going to talk about is identity resolution, anonymization, and identification. And I'm going to start out with an example of where a government agency has made use of identity resolution and record linkage to attempt to do something that's a reasonable thing to do. So I'm going to read a little bit from this article. The article appeared in Al Jazeera, but it actually was a partnership between the Pulitzer Center and Al Jazeera. What the title of the article is: How an Algorithm Denied Food to Thousands of Poor in India's Telangana. So I believe that's a region. And the article started out by talking about a specific individual that says she can't conceive of owning a car. The 67-year-old widow and 12 members of her family live in a cramped 3-room house in an urban slum in Hyderabad, the capital of the Indian state of Telangana. Since her rickshaw puller's husband's death 2 years ago of mouth cancer, she makes a living by peeling garlic for a local business. But an algorithmic system which the Telangana government deploys to digitally profile its more than 30 million residents tagged B's husband as a car owner in 2021 when he was still alive. This deprived her of the subsidized food that the government must provide to the poor under the Indian food security law. So let's just review this setup. We have a woman who is poor. Her husband has died. Her husband did not own a car. He just pulled a rickshaw. She needs food. She's part of the probably millions of people who need government assistance. And the issue here is that her family's listed as being below poverty line, but when they do this analysis, they find out that they believe that her husband actually owns a car. Now, how did this happen? Well, in her case, and again, I'm reading from the article, this algorithm and system, Samagra Vedika, mistook her late husband Syed Ali, the rickshaw puller, for Syed Haider Ali, a car owner, and the authorities accepted the algorithm's word. This woman, B, is not the only victim of such digital snafus. From 2014 to 2019, Telangana canceled more than 1.86 million existing food security cards and rejected 142,000 or plus fresh applications without any notice. It was claimed that these were fraudulent claimants of subsidy and that they were trying to weed out ineligible beneficiaries to save large sums of money. Now, I've experienced this not on that same level of criticality, but and I'm gonna, I've said this before in some of our other episodes. My name is a relatively uncommon name. There's me. There's the vision professor. I think he's retired at this point, former dean of the School of Optics or Optometry at Nova Southeastern University. He's Dr. David Loshin. I have a cousin who coincidentally has the same name as me, although I actually go by my middle name and he goes by his first name. He lives out in Arizona now, but used to live out in Seattle. I've actually come across a handful of others, but it's not like there's, it's not like if you recall, I'm going to make a reference to an anachronism, the thing called a telephone book, which used to be this doorstop collection of pages that listed everybody who had a telephone number that you could thumb through. I mean, the equivalent today is going to Google and searching for somebody's name and asking for their telephone number, but used to be a thick book, and if you open it up to the Smiths, you'd probably find thousands of John Smiths. So it's not like there's lots of people named David Loshin, but I still get emails and letters and survey requests that are targeted to one of the other David Loshins. And so that's an example of identity resolution that has gone bad. Specifically in that one case with the hotel survey, they had identified the other gentleman as being me by linking his name to my hotel frequent traveler account, and that's why they connected it. So this happens, and it happens probably much more frequently than you realize, but often there are humans in the pipeline and they're able to weed out some of these things, or there's other types of guardrails that are put into place to make sure that identity resolution or incorrect record linkage doesn't happen.
So why are governments employing these types of systems?
Well, I mean, in this particular instance, it's an organization, or an agency that wants to try to save money. So they're looking for violators. They're looking for people who are filing for claims in a way that is not consistent with what the rules are. So, presumably, according to the way that I read the article, if you are a car owner, you probably are considered to be above the poverty line, and therefore you don't qualify for food assistance.
So if you were building this system, because it seems like they maybe relied too much on the algorithm, too much on technology, too much on, and if you read further down in the article, there was a 4-year dispute resolution cycle before they rejected it outright. I mean, it's clear that they didn't bake in a way for people who perhaps have been misidentified as being able to challenge that ruling or dispute it or file some sort of...
Yeah, I think it's actually, there's two other aspects of this that I want to point out. Number one, that example that they give in the article, and it's just one example. So there's probably lots of other similar examples.
Well, I got to believe that algorithm is cranking through
millions
of cases.
Millions, right. But the issue here is that that's not even a good identity resolution, because it is matching, it's showing that there's two names that are matching. And one of the names that's matching has a middle name and the other one does not. So and by the way, a parenthetical comment is that number one, I've been doing this kind of work on identity resolution and record linkage for over 25 years. In fact, that's what transitioned me. By the way, I'm wearing a relic, which is a shirt from one of my first jobs from a company called Thinking Machines Corporation.
Thinking Machines was, I do believe they were located in Cambridge, right down the street.
They were absolutely located in Cambridge, and in fact, when I was up in Boston last week, I was able to show my family where I used to work, or the same neighborhood in Kendall Square. And this is a shirt from the CM5. So at the time, I was a software developer, and I transitioned to working on data, from the high performance computing space, and found that most of the work that I was doing was involved in writing algorithms or writing code to link records together, or to verify that linked records, that the fidelity of the linkage was close enough. And that's what kind of let me slide into data quality. And that's why I've been working on data quality for all these years, decades, I should say. And so I started with developing these applications or codes that made use of algorithms that have been around. Like I was mentioning to you before we started, these techniques have been around for 70 years. I mean, if you look back in the literature, the original people who are talking about administrative record linkage, there are papers from the early 1960s, 1940s, and they talk about the process and the justifications for why an algorithm could be used to do record linkage. So it's not like this is new technology, and despite your you're jumping to talking about AI. This is not AI. It's just statistics and analysis.
But in the subhead, just the Al Jazeera article, it says this new system adopted AI and welfare schemes to weed out ineligible. And so clearly AI is the keyword of the moment, because they managed to shoehorn it into the subhead.
That was for the purposes of search engine optimization.
Yep.
Probably, but no. I mean, this is not. I mean, maybe I'll rephrase that. There are newer additions to the state of the art that do involve using machine learning. I'm not going to.
I mean, this is machine learning by another term. I mean, some of this stuff gets a little blurry, but it's not kind of the classic generative AI, large language model AI that we're it's pattern inferencing.
So anyway, the pattern, like you need to have a lot of pieces of information to be able to feel pretty confident that your match is truly a match, because no matter where you are, there is going to be some probability that two records that match should have matched. There's a probability that two records that match should not have matched. There's a probability that two records that should not have matched should match. And there's the probability that two records that should not match actually don't match. So I just basically laid out the map of those quadrants in a square.
Well, so I mean, walk through. I mean, I get how these things happen, and as you do kind of dig in on this article a little bit, I think there's a reference to this system is cycling through 30 million cases, something like that. It's a shockingly large. It's digitally profiling more than 30 million residents in India. So
and
it's a shockingly large data set.
Of course.
And so you're naturally, and I think again the what this thing came down to is a subset of a very small number who were denied, and now are making a case, disputing that. But what is the data? I mean, you're the data quality king. What is the data quality challenge here? What is the data quality counter solution to kind of smooth out this sort of error generation?
Well, actually, I'm gonna pivot on that one, because I love when you ask the question that is going to lead into what is the meat of our conversation that's going to crop up in our next part. Because,
am I getting ahead of us again?
No. You're like going down one path, and I want to get back on a different path, which is that of course, if I wanted to, so naively, if I wanted to do a record linkage of 30 million residents, I'm going to try to match every one of those 30 million records with every other one of those 30 million records. And I don't have let me pull out my calculator. I don't even know if my calculator has enough digits for this, but if I had 30 million.
Probably not.
There.
That's
30,
a lot of zeros.
That's 30 million. That's I got 30 million times 3, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And that is 9 followed by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So what's that, like 90 quadrillion comparisons? And there's no computer on Earth that could do that in the remaining time that the Earth is going to be around.
Well, so again, how do they who builds, who sells it? Forget who builds it. Who sells this? How do you sell that story?
Right. So what they do is again, this goes back to, I don't know whether I did that.
There's a strange hubris where
it doesn't matter. It's a lot of zeros.
Bureaucrats in the entire world to be able to do this by hand.
So they don't do it that way. What they do is they actually do what's called blocking, which is somebody who lives in New Jersey and somebody who lives in California. There's a pretty low probability that they're going to match. Now it's not a zero probability, because I could be a California resident with a home on the Jersey Shore. So it's not impossible, but what they do is blocking, and they block by different variables. So for example, they will block by zip code. I mean, when I talk about and zip codes, I'm talking about in this country, but postal code. So I can say, okay, I'm only going to look for people who live in the same postal code and then try to match records associated with those, or people who are of a particular age, or people whose telephone numbers start with a particular set of numbers. So what they do, this is called a blocking strategy. And the reason that they do this is that if I take 30 million residents and I break it down into 30 blocks, now I've got 30 collections of comparing a million by a million residents. So a million by a million is 10 billion or something. And that's still, I don't know, I could be wrong on that. So, correct me in the notes in the comments section. But that's still a lot, orders of magnitude less than 9 followed by 13 zeros. And so the more blocking variables I apply, thank you, 1 trillion. The more blocking values, so 30 trillion versus 90 quadrillion, that's like 4 orders of magnitude. So now I've already shaved off a large part of that. I can keep narrowing that scope. So if instead I had like 300 comparisons of 100,000 records, chunks of 100,000, again, that lowers the order of magnitudes of the computational performance needs. So I can do this. It's not a problem. What they probably did is they applied a bunch of these blocking variables, and they were able to narrow it down. But even so, you're still going to find people who share the same name or share similar characteristics, even within those blocking criteria. And when I first started working on this, I was living in DC. I was living in this huge building in near DuPont Circle, and there must have been 300 apartments in that building. And just for yucks, what I did was, this was when people's names were on the mailboxes in the front lobby. So I went down to the lobby and I just started looking through the names of the people who lived in the apartment, and I came up with three pairs of individuals who shared the same name, literally first name and last name. So not unusual. If you are familiar with this concept called the birthday paradox, it's an interesting illustration of this situation, which is that despite the fact that you believe that there's going to be a lot of variability, it turns out that there are lots of people who share some collection of similar attributes. And so what that means is that it's not unlikely that you're going to get false positives. So this was a false positive. And it was a false positive because probably her husband and the gentleman whose record that linked to it, they probably lived in the same area or the same general area, or they had similar characteristics or whatever. And so they ended up matching. It's just that they didn't have their variable set or their configuration set to be able to identify when and where to evaluate for false positives and false negatives. So false negatives are a little more of a problem, but the false positives are sort of a problem. But the main point that I kind of want to make here is not that we have issues with identity resolution. We're always going to have issues with identity resolution. The point that I do want to make, and maybe this is a good point for us to break on, is that there are lots of people who share certain common characteristics, but when you start looking at the combination of some of these common characteristics, you still start to see differentiation. So despite the fact that they're looking at those two records of two individuals that may live in the same general neighborhood and have some similarity in their name, there are probably still variables or other characteristics of those records that still differentiate the two.
Yeah, so why don't we take a break, and when we get back, we'll dig in a little bit more on this idea of identifiable or identifiability and levels of data that can be used to make those distinctions between seemingly similar individuals.
Sounds good.
Solutions Review is inviting you to join InsightJam.com. What started a few years ago as a social media event to celebrate enterprise technology has now grown into an always-on tech community with live events, discussions, videos, vendor showcases, and industry resources. Our vetted roster of experts, thought leaders, and analysts are sharing tips and tricks daily. So if you're interested in getting involved, join the long list of companies and brands who have already participated by visiting insightjam.com today. Now back to the show.
All right, David, we are back, and we're going to dig in. You've been getting your hands dusty, knee deep in some fairly arcane research papers. We've got Carnegie Mellon, we've got Georgetown Law. I mean, let's get after it.
So before the break, we were talking about the data elements that were being used or potentially not being used for doing administrative record linkage, and I'll make a reference to something that we've talked about before, which is HIPAA and privacy of healthcare information. And it turns out that in I believe in the high tech law, it's specified for the HIPAA privacy rule, talked about what that there are these 18 data elements that are considered to be protected healthcare information, and you're not allowed to disclose those values, right? So just to kind of justify why that makes sense, I'm going to point to that article that came from this graduate student. Her name is LaTanya Sweeney. She was at Carnegie Mellon. This was almost 25 years ago. She wrote this paper, and the name of the paper is "Simple Demographics Often Identify People Uniquely." And what she did is she did an experiment where she took 1990 census summary. This was in 2000, or was published in 2000, so it really happened before that. She reports on experiments that she conducted using data from the 1990 U.S. Census summary data to determine how many individuals within geographically situated populations had combinations of demographic values that occurred infrequently. It was found that combinations of few characteristics often combined in populations uniquely or nearly uniquely identify some individuals. And so here are some surprising results. It said using only 3 fields of information, even though typical data releases contain more fields, it was found that 87%, or 260 million out of 248 million of the population in the United States have reported characteristics that likely made them unique based only on 5-digit zip code, gender, and date of birth. So what she's saying, I'm gonna summarize what the paper says. What she is saying is that that despite the fact that census data is aggregated and it is anonymized, that despite that, if you had 3 pieces of information, the zip code, 5-digit zip code, gender, and date of birth, that 87% of the time you could uniquely identify who that individual is, which goes completely against our perceptions of what it means to de-identify data. It basically means that even if you have de-identified data, you are still potentially able to be re-identified.
Well, and I'm gonna go rogue here and give just a shout out to Dr. LaTanya Sweeney, who wrote this paper in 2020. 24 years later, she is now an incredibly well-regarded professor at Harvard. She got a PhD at MIT. She is a distinguished professor and was former CTO at the United States Federal Trade Commission. She's an absolute legend, and so there you go, kids. If you're working in grad school and you're working on these papers that you wonder where it's all headed, stick with it.
Stick with it,
and you'll end up as a Wikipedia noted.
So going with our theme of Boston and the Boston general area, see now that we've already talked about my visit to Boston. You're located up in the general area. You just mentioned MIT, and I'm gonna harken back to something that involves both you and Massachusetts, which is that part of the analysis that Dr. Sweeney did involved getting data from the voter registration for Cambridge, Massachusetts, and being able to do this analysis. I'm going to read from another paper, this is from Georgetown Law Tech Review. it makes a reference to what she had actually done, and it says that insufficiently de-identified structured data can occur when indirect identifiers are left in the data set, either inadvertently or for utility purposes. In the mid-1990s, Massachusetts purchased health insurance for state employees and subsequently released records summarizing every state employee's hospital visits. Then Governor of Massachusetts, Bill Weld, assured the public that the data had been properly scrubbed. The fields containing explicit identifiers such as name, address, and social security numbers were removed. However, the records still contain almost 100 unscrubbed attributes per patient that remained unscrubbed. The LaTanya Sweeney, then a graduate student, obtained the data and used the governor's zip code, birthday, and gender to identify his medical history, diagnosis, and prescription. So you've got a personal connection with Bill Weld.
I used to be riding shotgun with the governor back in those days as a special assistant, and I know he had some very specific requirements on the road with regard to. Well, I won't get into all of it, but anyway, the point of the matter is that I vaguely remember this. It was quite a little demonstration that Dr. Sweeney at the time. I don't think she was Dr. Sweeney, but it was quite a power move.
Yeah, it's actually, we're going to put the link in the notes for the podcast. Definitely, it's a very easily read paper. It's kind of eye opening. But similarly, in 2006, AOL released some data. They released 20 million search queries for 650,000 users as a data set that people could use to be able to do analysis, for 3 months of data. And they said that they attempted to scrub the data of direct or indirect identifiers, but it turns out yet again there was unique numbers assigned to each user, and because each user's search results can be viewed as a group. Soon after the release, New York Times reporters were able to track down individuals such as a 62-year-old widow in Georgia by analyzing those searches. So it turns out that even AOL, in their attempt to be good citizens and share some data, it turns out they release all sorts of data that was re-identified after the fact. And so I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that despite your efforts in trying to anonymize your data or remove identifiers that could be used for identification, there's still a significant amount of information that is embedded in these records that is not being removed, that still allows individuals to uniquely identify or somewhat uniquely identify in individuals within that or individual entities within that data.
I think this is, in fairness, I think, a lot of these examples are the kinds of examples, at least the last couple of examples, are the kinds of examples that have brought about more of a thoughtful approach to a lot of the data handling and governance that we see today, because it was and still remains in many cases completely reckless how data is handled and how easily it is absconded with.
Well, I'm going to step back into the AI pool and talk about how it's one thing if I've got structured data, because structured data, I can already attach values to predefined attributes associated with the entities that are stored in a database. So yeah, I can look at a birth date, I can look at a age range, even if it's just a range and not a specific birth date, or I could look at gender. All that stuff is tagged as here's the column, here's the value. But now with these tools that are being used for analyzing unstructured data and the generative AI systems that can be used to build taxonomies associated with characteristics relating to individuals who are tagged in these unstructured records, they can start building up what might be called knowledge graph, or what would be called knowledge graphs, that contain information even if there's been de-identification. So, for example, even if I took a PDF and I redacted all the names, but it's an article about individuals who have been involved in a lawsuit, or individuals who've been targeted for some kind of clinical trial, or whatever. Even if the names have been eliminated, there's still a lot of information that can be extracted from the text, and they can start building up a knowledge graph which contains references to an individual, and or individual entities and their relationships. So, for example, I could have it's interesting because you can you look at a lot of the data sets that are being released, and you can get a pretty good idea about how this works. So, there's a Reddit database that I look at that has the names of the accounts have been anonymized, but I can still look at the relationship between two individuals who are posting to a Reddit a conversation, because I can see that individual A posted something to Reddit, individual B commented on it. So now I know that there's some kind of relationship between individual A and individual B. I don't know the extent of that relationship, but I know that the relationship exists. And then I can replicate that in my knowledge graph and be able to say, well, wait a second, I see that every single time there's a posting by individual A, there's a comment by individual B. Maybe they're working together. Maybe they're involved in some kind of pump and dump scheme, like our internet. What do they call that? The meme trading. It's a sophisticated technological way of saying pump and dump. And I can build a graph, and I can do interesting things with that graph, because I can superimpose structure in that graph over other structures in that graph, and be able to recognize patterns in the graph that allow me to then start saying, okay, well, I know from the data that I got from source A, it's been de-identified, but I do see that there's some kind of relationship between that individual and another individual, and the context in which that relationship is, and I see the properties associated with those relationships, and then as a byproduct, I can then look at that and see, oh, there's a similar structure in this other graph that came from this other data that was completely anonymized. And now that I see that the structure matches, I can just replicate the knowledge that I have and put it on top of that other piece of the graph. So yeah, I got that data from an anonymized source, but I just re-identified all that data. So I'm able to do that and be able to not only do that, but also get new context associated with how those things are related. So we'll also do an article a pointer to this other article. It's from Pursuit, University of Melbourne, How Small Details Can Create a Big Problem. And specifically, it's saying that details associated with things that are differentiable and are not related to something that applies to large populations, but rather details associated with smaller subsets of a population are much more distinct. I'll give you much more distinguishability of entities within that data set. And so even if I anonymize that data, just pulling data from some other source may allow me to re-identify those individuals. And to me, this poses a major information risk, because if we are obliged to ensure that we are protecting individuals' personal information, even if we see, this is false security.
Are we though?
Well,
is the government obliged to protect people's? At least it's my sense anyway that since 9/11, that's not really what's happening. At least not at the governmental level. Maybe we're obliged as a society to pretend like that, but there's no way that's actually happening. That there's data being overlaid on top of other data being overlaid on top of other data to profile everybody. Yeah,
and it's not just governments that are doing that, but companies are doing that. I'm not and to avoid falling into the trap of talking about.
David, I'm going to get us into trouble before we're going to get.
No, we're going to have that talk, we're going to talk about it, but in another episode. So,
again, I always
did
bristle at this idea that that everybody's out there effectively trying to do the right thing. It doesn't feel like that to me.
Well, I did qualify that by saying if they are.
Yeah.
So let's presume that they are. If they are, they still are at risk, because if they think that they have applied some set of anonymization techniques to prevent an individual's personal information from being exposed, but they don't understand the details to which the values that remain in that data set are still make that individual differentiable, somebody can get the right data set and use it as through integration of those data sets, be able to re-identify those individuals.
It can then be obviously used for all kinds of reasons, for profit or other nefarious reasons.
If we go back to looking at the original, conversation that we started with at the beginning of the show, we were talking about, the Indians, province or state's use of record linkage to try to identify individuals who were not qualified for the benefits that they were claiming. And that's a reasonable, if you are a fiscal conservative and you think that governments are spending, too much money on giving benefits to people who don't deserve them. I mean, without shifting to a political conversation, if you are driving around in a Mercedes and you live in a house that costs $1 million and you're applying for food stamps, I would hope that the government would investigate that. Now, if they're making presumptions,
means testing. I mean, there's any kind of number of and truth of the matter is I think this breaks both ways. I certainly don't. Well, I'm long since retired from politics, so I don't really pick a side anymore. But you can see how both sides would be keen to be able to leverage this data to do any number of things that are not for nefarious reasons, but just to actualize their political operations their politically directed governmental operations. So whether it's means testing on Social Security or welfare, or understanding, who should have gotten PPP money versus who shouldn't have gotten PPP. I mean, everybody, student loan debt, medical debt forgiveness, all these things that are being bandied about these days. I mean, all of that would inevitably, if they were to be operationalized, require some sort of system like this.
I completely agree with you when it comes to doing things like, I'll point to PPP because I actually spent a lot of time looking at data associated with the payroll, what was called payroll protection program during COVID. Yeah, it was something like that. But during COVID, I looked at a lot of that data, and there were some interesting artifacts that you could extract out of that data.
Well,
that would immediately lead you to if you actually had done some due diligence, would have brought up, like a question about whether everybody who deserved it should have been getting it. So we could. Well,
it was being sprayed around in such a liberal fashion because of the moment and the it's now been years, but the auditing still goes on to this day. I think part of the reason why there are so many IRS agents being funded in the last Congress was for just that purpose, to go crawl around and find out where all that COVID money wound up, because I think they're going about trying to claw some of that back, because I think it wasn't distributed with a lot of
oversight
data.
So why don't we cycle back on that, because we've got the same challenge here, which is how can we make use of integrating information from a variety of sources to uniquely identify when an individual is doing something that we want to know about. So we'll build upon what we just learned from Dr. Sweeney's I guess her paper from when she was at Carnegie Mellon.
But I mean, again, but I think we're probably starting to get to a point where we can start to answer some questions, or at least some of the questions I have. It's like, how do we get to a point where we have systems in place prior to these programs spraying dollars around like a confetti cannon, so that they're not just after the fact able to sort out, whether that was qualified, not qualified. I mean, it feels to me like, everybody's eager to kind of point out how it all went wrong during the initial distribution. But it's like, how do you get the discipline to say, before we're going to do anything, we're going to put something in place that either uses the proper data to be able to even determine whether you're qualified, and then secondarily be able to run you through some sort of systems check to make sure that you are indeed eligible after being determined to be qualified. Do you see what I'm saying there? That a system that actually has a
guardrails
collection of guardrails of double checking of actual thoughtful build, rather than after the fact saying, oh yeah, we probably, made a mistake.
So let's drill down into that after the break.
Want more Insight Jam? Follow us on Instagram for exclusive content like a daily dose of best practices and buying advice from industry experts and leading solution providers. Or subscribe to our YouTube channel for long-form highlights from our expert panel discussions. And if you prefer to listen, please rate and review the Insight Jam podcast on Apple, Spotify, or Google. The Solutions Review team is hard at work collecting the best enterprise technology information from around the globe, so don't miss out. Now, let's get back to the show.
All right, David. So we've identified a few broken toys out there. So how do we build systems or create guardrails around the systems so that they don't have these structural failures, and we're not talking about them, in papers years from now,
or on the front page of some newspaper.
Right.
So the issue here is a little more complicated, which is understanding the failure points in automated record linkage, and understanding that it's not, the technology is always going to have some borderline where, remember at the beginning we were talking about these 4 quadrants. It was things that should have matched that did match, things that shouldn't have matched that matched, things that should have matched but didn't, and things that shouldn't have matched that didn't match. And only 2 of those quadrants are right. Okay, the ones where 2 records that should have matched and they actually match, or 2 records that shouldn't have matched and they actually didn't match. The other ones are the false positives and the false negatives. And what we were talking about at the beginning was false positives. And the problem there is that because it's approximate, or because it's not an exact matching system, there's always going to be things that are going to fall through the cracks, and where you end up with things that match, and reasonably, even if a person looked at it, they would say that it matched. So this is the problem that I have with my co-named, not people who are not me, which is. I've probably given this example before, and I will again drill this down into this whole question of little things can have big impacts, and characteristics, small details have large impact. Characteristics that you would still think are enough to differentiate 2 individuals are still not enough. And I'll use that myself again, which is when I wrote my first book. It was in 1994. It was published, and I looked at when I got the copy. I opened it up, and beginning of every book there is a Library of Congress record notification, which basically says, yes, we have seen this. We've recorded it in our catalog, and we are assigning it this information. And I looked at it, and it said David S. Loshin, and that's not my name, but somehow they had connected, me as an author with this other person who actually had written another book. And so, first name, match. Last name, match. Authors, that is a characteristic of me and a characteristic of that other person. that typically most people are not authors of books, but one would say, okay, well, that's enough of a bizarre or unusual characteristic that I've got 3 pieces of information. I'm now going to link those 2 records together. And they did so incorrectly. And nobody would really know the difference, because nobody would assume that if the algorithm was confident enough to say it was a match, that somebody should have looked at it. Now when you've got these applications, when there's this range between, when they do similarity scoring on the pairs of records, there's some threshold that says if it's above that threshold, we'll call it a match. If it's below this lower threshold, we'll call it not a match. And everything in between is what they say is for administrative review. And so somebody actually sits down and looks at those records and says, okay, these are matches, these are not matches. Maybe they even use that to help retune or refine the rules that they use in their matching algorithms. But typically, nobody is going to the effort of looking at things that the algorithm said, yeah, this is a match, and looking at it and saying, no, actually, it was not a match. But we should have something like that. And the way to do that is to be able to have, and it's difficult to do this, but you need to have additional pieces of information that would allow you to be able to either distinguish or connect those 2 records from some additional source of information. Now, I think in the example,
does that begin to create? I mean, layering in another piece of data that may not necessarily be as quality through the bag all the way through the entire master data set as another attribute. Is that the next obvious thing to do, or do the systems designers just look at it and say, you know what? There was an acceptable amount of failure, that this is a margin for error that we're comfortable with when we built the system, that some people are going to get screwed.
Well, that's probably what happens. And in fact, if you go back to the article, it said that the governments linked to this with another system, which was called Aadhaar, which is a biometric-based unique identification number that's provided to every Indian, but it doesn't verify the eligibility of the claimant. So they've got these multiple data sets, and they've got one that they're presuming is going to be used to verify or authenticate through unique identification. But anybody can pull a number and just say, okay, well, that's my number, or they can leave off the number. So even if you're missing it, you're right. It's like there's some level of acceptable risk, and that is going to be equivalent to your error rate in your false positives or your false negatives.
And in your experience, is this the white whale of data governance that you're trying to get to absolute zero error, 100% perfection, or is it just it can never happen because of the nature of data collection and data input and data quality? There's always going to be an acceptable, is there a standard? Is there some acceptable standard of failure?
So the standard that I'm going to use is horseshoes and hand grenades. So when it comes to similarity between 2 records, it's the business context that is going to define what the level of acceptable risk is. So if you're playing horseshoes, you could get close and still score. And even though it wasn't an exact match, right? I mean, I don't know if you ever played horseshoes.
Yeah, no, I think that analogy is the idea that, close enough for horseshoes gets you points, close enough with a hand grenade gets you dead. So you want to be, if you are looking at food insecurity and giving people, people who are claiming, food benefits, your level of acceptable, errors is probably smaller than if you are, if you're applying for, a fishing license. But I'm curious. Well, what's you've run programs like this, and you've bid programs like this, and you've seen programs like this. What is the kind of bottom line guarantee that a provider would suggest? What do you typically see? They can't there's no way they could say we're going to be 100% perfect when the system finally starts spitting out results.
No, there's no way to be 100% perfect unless it's an exact match. So that's unlikely. I think that, going back to what we talked about in our previous episode about you and your father sharing the same name, except for, the third or the fourth or junior or whatever, you don't want your health record to be mixed up with your father's health record. And so unique identification and highly accurate identity resolution is critical in healthcare. And so you can't just rely on systems. You need to have individuals who are monitoring the output of those applications and ensuring that those are valid. So, if you're looking at
well, so again,
go ahead.
I'm gonna finally force AI into the conversation right here at the last in the last few minutes, just because I can't help myself. But isn't that the point here? That kind of work, that fail-safe kind of, purely bureaucratic whatever systems check can be replaced with AI and ultimately, have even more accuracy than a human being. Like that the human beings, and I think that first example we used, the human beings looked at it in the end, and they still denied it.
Yeah, well, so despite your how should I phrase it? Your anticipation and your of the infallibility of artificial intelligence, I don't think I would trust it today, and that's because even with
not today,
even with the best models, you're still only getting like 70% accuracy, and those systems, those generative AI systems or large language models, which are what we're relying on, what you're referring to, it's not necessarily like the machine learning algorithms from 20 years ago. If you give it the bad data to begin with, it's going to make bad decisions. And so if you give them, if you feed it, health records for 30 million people, it is going to look at the patterns that it sees in that data. And
I guess I'm thinking of it more as the machine learning of the algorithm model continues to function, but the dispute resolution goes through AI.
I'll give an example of that. There's this theoretical approach in record linkage called active learning, where the system is monitoring, with the administrative review. So when you run this algorithm, it matches a bunch of records. It will then walk through some randomly pulled sets of records and say, we match these two records. Is this really? And then present it to a user and say, is this a match? And based on what the user does, for example, if the user then says, well, I now got to look at this other data, or no, this is not a match, and they do it in a short amount of time versus a long amount of time, or they look at auxiliary data sources to try and verify that it should or should not be a match, I'm saying that it could learn from this contextual operational mechanism to be able to say, oh, well, now when I see this kind of result, maybe I need to go to a third or a fourth source. Or the fact that a human takes an extra minute to figure out whether this is or is not a match means that this differentiating these two entities in this pair of records is more complicated than some of the other ones that the user spent maybe 5 seconds looking at.
But in the end, I mean, that human is just an employee, replaceable, here today, gone tomorrow. They're not, there has to be a system that user is using in order for the system to receive those inputs and maintain that input. And ultimately that's the point of an AI system ultimately would be, and I'm not suggesting we're trying to replace the humans, but
you're trying to augment the human experience, and I'll tell you.
Well, and
if you are staring at for half an hour, staring at pairs of records, if you're still awake after 15 minutes, then I congratulate you.
It's not right. It's not the greatest career path that is going to bring out the best necessarily. I mean, there are reasons why AI would more sense.
No, but if you got 100 people doing it at the beginning of the process, a learning algorithm can make inferences from what those people do to then refine the model.
Correct.
To be able to be better. And so
Correct.
what you get is this virtuous cycle where
Pattern
it makes a lot of mistakes at the beginning, but by watching how people address those mistakes, it learns and makes fewer mistakes. And yes, eventually you can have this kind of thing supported by an automated environment. But even so, I would still recommend that every once in a while you have a bunch of people actually looking at the results and both the matches and the non-matches.
I think that would be for the best. I mean, the end game always should be to try to get to that elusive 100% perfection, or at least have a very equitable adjudication process that allows people to ultimately receive what they deserve.
Well, if I were going to put my data quality hat on, I would say the best thing would be for the data to go in the same way every place in the first place. So that, okay, my parents made the mistake of giving me a first name and never calling me by it. But if they'd done the right thing, that would never be a problem, because I wouldn't be saying David's my first name, because it really isn't my first name.
So when do we finally cross over from that? Because I mean, all these things are on a continuum, right? I mean, you're right. My birth records were paper, obviously, but my, kids aren't going to be. So
no, I think we're getting there, because all this the byproduct of massive amounts of data that are available for doing linkage is pointing out all these places where what I assumed was okay 20 years ago is no longer okay. So, I'm never going to get my doctor to not call me by my first name, because I had to fill out all my forms using my official first name. And when Starwood bought Marriott, or the other way around, and I wanted to merge my hotel accounts, it wouldn't do it, because in one case it was spelled one way, I used David as my first name, and the other place I didn't. So they wouldn't match it, and since they wouldn't match it, I had to show my birth certificate or something.
And
I don't know.
Do you see that as always? I mean, as you kind of look at it, is there any way that this will eventually, or is that just a slippery slope? You don't want to actually have, a singular permanent record for every individual, because then you get down to this level of kind of digital identification and tracking that can become, in some circles, non-ideal.
Yeah, but isn't that already? Look, the fact that
now you're wearing my hat.
87% of the time, I can tell you who you are given your birth date, your zip code, and your gender. I have even more information. Then yes, I mean, eventually I'm going to have enough data is going to be collected by enough people to be able to create that unique identification. It's just a question of
why every time I go to the doctor, they ask me to fill out the same form over and over and over again? Why is that?
Because somebody's paying them an incentive to have you do that. That's why.
All right.
So
I think that's I think we've gone full circle on this one. So that's good. I'm looking forward to the next, and I do want to hold your feet to the fire on us going down the whole privacy path at some point. Maybe we dig in on some other things as well. Certainly, there's plenty of government programs that we can have a field day with.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thanks again for the time, David. If anybody needs a data governance expert, David Loshin is your man. Knowledge integrity is the best way to get a hold of him. You can get a hold of David Loshin on LinkedIn. Just don't confuse him with any of the other David Loshins on LinkedIn. Make sure you find the handsome one. And also, you can go to insightjam.com and find him there as well. He's one of our solutions review experts in residence at the Insight Jam. And David, once again, good talking. Thanks for the time, and we'll see you in another couple weeks.